Lith Goffa Raymond Williams, Michelle Matheron dwi o'r Brifysgol Agored yn Gymru. Mae'n bleser mawr I weld cynife ohonoch yma heddiw. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd am ddod. Welcome to the Raymond Williams Memorial Lecture. I'm Michelle Matheron from the Open University in Wales. It's really lovely to see so many of you here today. We are really pleased to be partnering once again with the Learning and Work Institute on this important lecture. As organisations, we both understand and are passionate about the transformative power of education, and we work often together to make learning as accessible as possible. We are really pleased to have Vicky Howells, the Minister for Further and Higher Education, with us here today. Thank you for being here, Minister, and thank you for your support for our shared endeavour of the power of lifelong learning. It is a real privilege for me to be able to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton. Sabrina is a firefighter, a psychologist, and an author. Sabrina was born and raised in Newport, and when she was just 9 years old, her father tragically died of a brain tumour. Later, aged 15, she found herself homeless. Sabrina survived by selling The Big Issue, a social business which she credits with saving her life, and which she now represents as an ambassador. She is also an advocate for Homewards, part of the Royal Foundation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Selling The Big Issue enabled Sabrina to save some money and to get a flat. She joined the fire service at just 18 years of age, the first woman in her station. While serving, she pursued higher education through the Open University, achieving her first-class degree in psychology in 2009. She then went on to complete her PhD at Cardiff University's Behavioural Neuroscience Lab in 2013. At the age of just 36, she was appointed Chief Fire Officer of West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service, making her one of the most senior firefighters in the UK. She was awarded the King's Fire Service Medal for Distinguished Service and Gallantry in the 2023 Birthday Honours, and later this year she will take up a new role as Chief Fire Officer for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Her first book, The Heat of the Moment, A Firefighter's Stories of Life and Death Decisions, was published in 2019. The book is a first-hand exploration of the skills and characteristics needed to survive and thrive as a firefighter. Her research into the decision-making of incident commanders has received many academic accolades and influenced policy change across the world. Her second book, The Gender Bias, examines systematic barriers hindering women's progress and provides actionable strategies to overcome them. And her third book, What Your Dog Is Thinking, was published this year and combines her passion as a dog lover with her expertise in neuroscience. Raymond Williams stressed the importance of making learning part of the process of social change. Sabrina's experience exemplifies both the importance of lifelong learning, but also the social change that can come when we encounter an education system that enables us to learn throughout life and then give back to society as a result. Sabrina has received numerous accolades, and we were absolutely delighted to welcome her to our Open University in Wales graduation ceremony in 2022 and present her with an honorary doctorate. Sabrina's speech to our students on that day was both moving and motivating in equal measure, and I am sure we are in for more of the same today. So please welcome Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction. And can I just check? I am quite short. Can you all see me? I was really humbled to be invited to give this lecture today. So thank you to both the Open University and the Learning and Work Institute for thinking of me for this lecture. I want to start off by saying poverty isn't something that you wash from your skin. And I know that from bitter experience because I grew up in poverty. I grew up not far from here, actually, in Newport, and I have a backstory that is by no means unique. I grew up in a single-parent household after my father died. My mum found it incredibly difficult to cope, and she struggled with her mental health. And as she did so, we drifted further and further into poverty. We grew up without heating. We had a Calagas heater that the three of us, me, my mother, and my brother, would huddle round. We didn't have food in our fridge. When we went to school hungry and a bit grubby, if I'm really honest. And we felt completely isolated. And do you know what? It's actually really expensive being poor. You would be amazed at the premium people experiencing poverty pay. Even things like electricity, we couldn't afford the electricity bills, so my mum ended up on a prepayment meter. And would you believe that that's actually more expensive than just being on a normal electricity bill? So even the basics become more expensive. If you don't have enough money to make ends meet, you need to borrow money. But the rates that you pay are even more expensive because the risk of you not paying it back are even greater. There's a real premium that you have to pay when you're experiencing poverty, and that has an impact. And I saw the impact that it had on my mum. So when I'd go to school as a young girl, I'd go to school hungry, I'd go to school stressed and worried and afraid for my mum and coping with what I was seeing her experience. And I went to school being quite disconnected from other people and quite isolated, and people didn't want to be my friend because I was the grubby weird kid. I can remember one girl not even being allowed to hang around with me because we didn't have a washing machine, and it showed. So when you think about this, it's not just unique to me. There are young people today going through exactly the same experience. How prepared do you think you'd be to learn when you're coping with all of this in the background? And my answer is not very at all. And it got worse for me. By the time I was 15, nearly 16, my home life was too volatile, and it became incredibly difficult. And I ended up leaving home and sleeping rough on the streets of Newport, just a couple of miles from here. And honestly, it was awful. I would sleep in shop doorways. Sometimes I'd sleep in the porch of a derelict church, and other times I'd sleep in a derelict building, anywhere where I could, really. And honestly, I've been punched and kicked and spat at because people thought I had no value. They treated me like I was scum on their shoes. And I felt it. I really felt it. And let me give you an example about the practicality of life when you're sleeping rough. There was one time I can remember feeling so hungry. It was a burning hot day, a bit like today actually, and I hadn't eaten properly for days. And I didn't have any money, I didn't have anything. And I can remember sitting near a hot dog van, watching people eating hot dogs. I can remember looking and thinking, oh, I'm so hungry, what I wouldn't give for a hot dog right now. And you know, like sometimes people will get a hot dog and they will be really hungry, so they'll take a couple of bites and then they'll chuck it in the bin. And I was watching people doing this. And you know, when you're hungry and you're seeing someone eat, it makes you even more hungry, right? Well, I thought to myself, don't do it, Sab, don't do it, Sab. And of course then I did it. I waited for someone to have a couple of bites and threw a hot dog in the bin, and I went and I fished it out and I started to eat it. And I looked up and I could see these people staring at me like I was disgusting. And look, I'll be fair, it is pretty gross to eat a hot dog out the bin, granted, but I can remember thinking, why are you looking at me with such disgust? I don't need your judgment, I need help. It was so dehumanizing, and I had that experience time after time after time when I was rough sleeping. I started selling a street magazine called The Big Issue, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but for those of you who aren't, it's an incredible street magazine that you buy for cost price as a vendor and you sell on for a profit. So each big issue vendor that you see is actually a micro-entrepreneur earning their own money. It was absolutely life-changing for me because it gave me some structure and it gave me an ability to earn something and a bit of self-respect. But during this time, I carried on going to school, actually, which you might feel surprised to hear. And I admit it probably wasn't my priority at the time, but there were a couple of things for me. Firstly, I was terrified of going into care. Absolutely terrified. We had social workers that were back and forth, and when you have a caregiver who loves you very deeply but doesn't have the capacity to look after you, you're raised to see any kind of authority figure through a lens of mistrust. So I thought going into care would be like some kind of Dickensian workhouse that I had to avoid at all costs. So I carried on going into school and trying to pretend that things were okay, even though they really weren't. And it's interesting, you know, because no one would have known why I was acting out the way that I was as a 15, 16-year-old girl. And to be fair to my teachers, I was probably a bit of a nightmare. But that's the thing. We meet people every day, and we don't know what they're going through behind closed doors. We really don't. And it was actually a really early lesson in compassion for me. But I carried on, and I also thought that if I went to school, not only would I avoid going into care, which was a big plus, but I also thought that it might just be my ticket out of there at some point, probably a bit naively as a 15, 16-year-old. But I sat my GCSEs nonetheless. It was a difficult period, but I managed it. But I really felt like nobody cared. And I can remember one day I was selling The Big Issue, and one of my teachers walked past me. And I kind of had this moment of hope in terms of, oh, maybe he's seen me and maybe he'll actually care. And do you know what he did? He looked down at his shoes, he crossed the road, and he walked on by. And I felt like, at that point, honestly, nobody cared. And I can remember just looking down at my little dog. I was a stray girl, he was a stray dog, it worked, and just bursting into tears. And I crouched down in the shop doorway, and I just hugged him, and I sobbed. And I felt so alone at that moment in time. But The Big Issue really helped me, because initially I was selling it in Newport, and there were about 12 other people doing the same thing, so it was quite hard to earn any kind of money. You were kind of living hand to mouth. So I found a town called Monmouth, which was about an hour away on the bus, and I'd buy a stack of magazines, and I'd get on a bus at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I'd go up there, and I'd stay there till 7 o'clock at night if I had to, until I'd sold all my magazines. And that, for me, eventually provided me with enough to put a deposit down on a very cheap, very nasty rented flat. There were a couple of false starts, including a period of time sleeping in a van and a room in a shared house, but I was attacked by someone else that lived there, and I ended up back on the street. So it's not as simple as just having a roof. It's really not. There's a whole process of recovery from homelessness, which I'll talk about shortly. But when secure accommodation, really secure accommodation, became a reality for me, I started to think about what else could become a reality for me. And that's when I started to think about the fire service. And the thing about the fire service is, to be truthful, it's a real privilege, because you're trusted by people to know what to do when they're having the worst day they've ever had. And I kind of felt like I could relate to that, because I'd had quite a long period of time when I felt like every day was the worst day I was ever having. And so, although the context was different, the sentiment was definitely the same. And I hoped that I might be able to help other people in a way that no one had been able to help me. But I didn't talk about my experience of homelessness for a really long time. I moved to a place called Risca because it was a little bit away from Newport, and I didn't know anybody there, and nobody knew me, and I felt like maybe I can have a fresh start here. Maybe I don't have to feel so ashamed of what happened to me. Not that I should have to feel ashamed, but I did, and I didn't want anyone to know. And then, as I started to progress in the fire service, I started to become more and more afraid of people maybe finding out what had happened to me, because I thought they might judge me. I thought they might judge me in a way that I'd been judging myself, and the way I'd felt other people judge me for so long. Because like I said in the beginning, the thing about poverty is it's not something that you can just wash off your skin. Honestly, it permeates every aspect of your experience. It really does. And when I look back and I first moved into a flat, honestly, I was really unhealthy. I was super unhealthy. I had no idea what a good diet was like. I couldn't afford decent food. I was just getting processed stuff because it was the cheapest thing. And it's not just me that this relates to. The data shows this really clearly. People who have a low socioeconomic status have got poorer health outcomes. In fact, a study in The Lancet showed that the impact on your health, on your life expectancy, if you have low socioeconomic status, is equivalent to smoking. It's 2.1 years. 2.1 years less life because of your social class, your access to money, and your educational prospects. That is incredible, isn't it, when you think about it? And it's not just your health, it affects your educational attainment as well. Again, those on free school meals are 57% less likely to get an A or above in GCSE. So poverty, not your IQ, not your aptitude, not your motivation or your personality, but poverty is the biggest indicator of how well you'll do in school. You know, hunger impacts on your cognitive ability, if you're not prepared to go into school and study because of your home life, of course you're not going to do as well as everybody else. And the thing is, we've all heard about the glass ceiling, right? That barrier that is really hard to smash through. What we don't talk about so much is the glass breadline, that invisible barrier of social norms and preconceptions that prevent social mobility. There is a glass breadline that no one can see, but believe me, we feel it all too intently. And don't just take my word for it. Let me share the data with you. ONS data shows that if you're on free school meals, only 18% of women and 28% of men have achieved over the living wage by the age of 25. And this is the living wage, by the way. This isn't an average wage. This is the bare minimum that you need to cover the essentials, like your housing, like your food, like your childcare. That's £12.21 an hour. And in my experience, that glass breadline is something that you impose on yourself and other people impose on you. It becomes a cycle. It is so difficult. When I was experiencing homelessness and I'd see other people judging me or scowling at me or kicking my stuff because I just sat on the side of the street, it has such an effect on you. And I can remember thinking to myself so many times, do you know what? There are 7 billion people in the world. I know that you don't know me. Why would your opinion matter to me? But the truth is, we're human beings and we're hardwired to absorb the way people respond to us as social information. And that informs the way that we expect the next person to respond to us. It becomes the way we see ourselves, the way we speak to ourselves. It becomes our inner narrative. It has a really big impact on your sense of who you are and where your place is in the world. Raymond Williams said that culture isn't just an expression of society, but it also shapes it. And it's really true. And I know that all too keenly. Like I said, I was terrified of people finding out that I'd experienced homelessness because I didn't want them to judge me, and I didn't want to start judging myself in the same way as well. And do you know what? There's some real truth to this. I'm Jewish, and our sages say that our thoughts shape reality. And it's really true, because if you cultivate positive thoughts, then you cultivate positive words. If you cultivate positive words, then you cultivate positive actions. And that results in a reality that drives good things, right? But how are you going to do that if you're constantly seeing yourself as less than, and people are reminding you that you're less than? Quite without meaning to, granted, but believe me, you feel it nevertheless. Now, the recovery from homelessness is something that's tough, but it is possible. And I've said a few times already, poverty isn't something that you wash from your skin. And I learned this. And eventually I learned to embrace it. So now I no longer try to wash it from my skin. And I advocate for other people who are experiencing the same that I once did. I'm now an ambassador for The Big Issue. I'm an ambassador for Street Vet, who do some amazing work with people experiencing homelessness who have pets. And I'm also an advocate for Prince William's incredible programme called Homewards, which aims to demonstrate that it is possible to end homelessness within the next 5 years. And I never, ever thought that I would be in a position to be advising someone like the Prince of Wales on the experience of people like me who'd experienced homelessness and who'd experienced poverty. But I am. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is how important it is to remove the stigma that's associated with homelessness, the stigma that's associated with poverty. We have to change that narrative. We have to change those social norms that Raymond Williams was talking about that really do shape our reality. And we have to change those preconceptions so that they won't affect us in the same way. Now, when I started talking about my experience of homelessness, something amazing happened. Other people who'd also been experiencing homelessness but hidden it also started to share their story. I have 2 firefighters working with me at the moment who've both experienced homelessness and who now feel able to openly talk about it. That's amazing, isn't it? That people can now openly share an experience that they once thought they didn't ever want anyone to know about. And the more we do that, the more we can normalise the recovery from homelessness. And that is crucial. But honestly, a crucial part of my journey was education. Education is an anti-poverty tool. I went from experiencing homelessness to becoming the first woman chief fire officer in 2 fire services, to becoming an honorary fellow and a professor at Cardiff University, and doing research that shaped the way that we deal with incidents in the UK Fire and Rescue Service, even to advising the Prince of Wales. I did that through education. Now, I didn't initially join the fire service and think, great, I'm going to go back and study stuff. Honestly, I never did. But I was sparked one day by an incident where I was responding to a firefighter that had been badly burned. And at the time, we thought it was my husband-to-be who was on that fire engine where someone had been burned. And I'll never forget the day where the bells went down like they'd done 1,000 times before. And I got on the truck, not knowing whether it was him or somebody else that had been injured. I can remember feeling incredibly torn between the role of a responder and all of the kind of normal responsibilities and accountabilities that go with that, but also the role of a loved one and all of the normal fears and anxieties that happen when you think that someone you really care about has been injured. And when we arrived there, I was fortunate. It wasn't him. Although he had very nearly been killed at that incident, a colleague of ours, a friend of ours, had been really badly burned. And it was the way that I felt after this incident that really bothered me, because I carried a significant amount of guilt, because I felt like by not wanting it to be my husband, I felt like I'd wished it on somebody else. And I really, really struggled with that. And at first I thought, well, maybe we can do something to stop it from happening to anyone else. Maybe we can develop a better burns pack. So I started to do my due diligence on my Google research, and I found something that really changed the course of my life. I found that most of the injuries that happen to people happen as a result of human error. Not a problem with a piece of equipment or a flawed policy, but a human mistake. Someone somewhere makes the wrong choice in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that meant someone got hurt. And so I thought, well, maybe if we can understand human error better, then we can do something about it. But look, I left home at 15 and school at 16. I didn't come from a background of psychology. Who's going to listen to me? So I went back to night school with the Open University and did a psychology degree so I could learn more about it. And I really got the bug. And I went all the way through to doing a PhD at Cardiff Uni. And do you know what? I never could have done it without the flexibility that we have from adult learning. The Open University is amazing. It is absolutely geared up to people who are learning in a non-traditional way. Traditional university wasn't an option for me. I couldn't afford not to work. But the Open University allowed me to study around working, around getting married, around having a child, around all of those things. It's incredible. And then Cardiff University showed me a kind of flexibility that's actually quite rare for a university. They opened up the neuroscience lab to me in the night so I could go there around my shifts. I'd go to the lab at like 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd run my experiments. I would go to work at 8 o'clock. I'd pull a full shift in the fire service. I'd go home. I'd put my newborn daughter to bed because she was born the day my PhD started. That was great timing, wasn't it? And then, oops. And then I'd go back into the lab for the night shift, and I'd be there until 12, 1 o'clock in the morning sometimes. But they were amazing, and their flexibility enabled me to achieve that. I was registered on a part-time PhD, which should take 7 years, but I completed it in 3 years because of their flexibility. They had to re-register me as a full-time student so I could submit. But they were really wonderful. But do you know what? Adult learning and flexible learning still isn't normalised. You still have to battle perceptions. I can remember my first day when my professor was showing me around the lab. There was a postdoc there, and my professor had introduced me, and she looked me dead in the eye and said, "What, you're doing a part-time PhD? Are you crazy? You'll never finish." And I kind of looked at my professor, and he kind of looked at me apologetically, and we went on our merry way. And, he said, "Look, I'm sorry about that. And I said, don't worry, I'm used to it. Everybody says the same thing when I tell them I'm doing a PhD. But our adult learners shouldn't have to battle those preconceptions. And there's something that we can do about that. You know, there really, really is. And sometimes I have these quiet moments of reflection, and I've been really fortunate. I've been able to do a PhD. I've been able to use the research that we've done to change the landscape for fire and rescue services. And I've been invited all over the world to lecture on decision-making in critical circumstances. And I can remember sitting once on a plane on the runway, and I was flying to Colombia to talk about decision-making out there. And I have these moments of gratitude that I was able to do it. Then I had this kind of moment of disbelief. But then I have these darker yet fleeting moments of self-doubt where I still feel that I don't belong. And you still have that poverty mindset that creeps in that makes you feel like an imposter. But look, education along with public service completely changed my life chances. Education wasn't just an anti-poverty tool for me. It was my anti-poverty weapon. Now, education shouldn't be dependent on your social class. Knowledge does not belong to those who are born with wealth. And tuition isn't an entitlement of just the elite. And privilege isn't what should pave the way to the top jobs. Education should be open to everybody with the curiosity to seek it. And for me, that's why adult learning opportunities like the Open University and like the Learning and Work Institute are so powerful. Because social mobility depends on education. And believe me, social mobility is so hard. When you're experiencing poverty, you're not limited by your potential. You're just limited by your access to opportunities. And when you're in poverty, trapped by people's perceptions that reinforce the glass breadline, it follows you and it shapes your reality. There was a really interesting study that I read about that looked at people in elite professions, and it wrote 316 fictitious CVs, and they matched them for male and female and low and high socioeconomic status. And then they sent them out to real law firms and they monitored the results. Interestingly, high socioeconomic status men were 4 times more likely to be called back to interview than men or women from a low socioeconomic status. So these perceptions about poverty, these perceptions about social class are so harmful, not just to people, but to society as a whole. You've got elite brains there that are missing out on elite opportunities and elite jobs. And elite professions are missing out on some of the best talent because their vision is so tainted by the glare of that glass breadline. And there is a lot of potential talent out there. 14 million people are in poverty today. 1 in 5 of us. 4 million children are in poverty. 8 million people are in poverty, but they're still working, trying to make ends meet, but they're still sitting below that glass breadline. And now this is where gender intersects, to put an extra layer of glazing on that glass breadline for women. We know from ONS data that women are more likely to be in low-paid professions than men. 17% of women compared to 11% of men are in low-paid professions. But interestingly, women are paid 3% less on average than men in those professions. And the thing is, when you're in one of those low-paid professions, flexible working is seldom an option. Low-paid work can be really sporadic and non-standard, and sometimes you just have to accept those hours as mandatory. You don't have a choice, and it becomes circular. Half of children in a single-parent household today are in poverty, and 85% of single-parent households, you guessed it, are headed by women. It becomes circular. So flexible access to education is so important, as is the funding that supports it, not just for tuition, but to be able to live while you're learning. If you're working long hours and you're trying to make ends meet, and you're trying to look after whether it's family or children or whoever you have responsibility for, it is hard. You need more than just the motivation to do it. You need the means. Frankly, you need the energy by the end of the day as well. And there are some really simple things that can help this really complex problem. Improved access to affordable childcare would help so many people break that cycle, along with more flexible working options to support these lifelong learning opportunities. And something that I feel really strongly about is considering social mobility when we're recruiting. I really feel that socioeconomic status should be treated as a protected characteristic. It's something you're born into, and it's something that you can't help. And I think that when we talk about recruitment, if we use socioeconomic status to guide our outreach activities, to raise awareness, we could really make a big difference. The Bank of England do this really well, actually. They offer paid internships for people from low socioeconomic status. We could use things like the index of multiple deprivation to target recruitment activities so that we really do get more from it. Because social mobility doesn't mean that you have to fit, but it does mean that we all have to be okay with being a bit more different. And Raymond Williams said, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." If we all put a crack in that glass bread line today, tomorrow, maybe our children can watch it shatter. That feels like some tangibly possible hope. Thank you.
I am now really pleased to invite the Minister to come up. She's very delighted to be asking the questions for once instead of answering them. So look forward to the conversation between the two of you. Diolch yn fawr, thank you.
Oh, well, thank you all for coming today. And isn't it just so wonderful to hear Sabrina's story? Absolutely inspirational story from homelessness to Chief Fire Officer. And it really does illustrate to us how powerful education can be as a genuine pathway out of poverty. And in my role as Minister for Further and Higher Education, I'm really committed to building an education system that reaches everyone, especially those that are facing the greatest challenges. And I agree with everything you said there about education being an anti-poverty tool. So it is really such a privilege to be able to ask you the questions today as I look to the future within my portfolio and how we want to enhance our offer here in Wales for adult education and to combat issues around poverty, mental health challenges for all young people and adult learners as well. So I'm really looking forward to asking you these questions so that I can learn more. And I know there's a lot of people involved in the policy space here today, so they'll be listening intently as well, I'm sure. So, as we said then, your personal journey is an incredibly powerful and unique one in many ways. And in your view then, what do you think are the most persistent structural barriers that prevent others from breaking out of poverty, breaking that through that glass bread line and fulfilling their potential, especially women? You talked about childcare as part of the lecture there, but just interested to hear a bit more.
Do you know, I really do think that the fundamental problem is perception. It really, really is. The way that you view yourself once you've experienced poverty is something that really does stay with you. And this has certainly been my biggest challenge. It's the way that you then see yourself and the way that you expect other people to see you. And people do still hold judgments. They have assumptions. They have assumptions based on the education that you've had or haven't had. They have assumptions based on where you come from. They have assumptions based on how you talk. And I think if we could do more to really kind of change the narrative and take some of the stigma away from those things, I think that that would have a really big benefit. When I started to think about education as an adult, I was a little bit daunted by it because I thought, can I do it? Will I succeed? What will people think? And it was only by exploring the Open University that I found out that it was structured in a way that meant that I could do it. It was possible, but it wasn't something that I'd automatically thought about. But certainly from my perspective as an employer now, if someone says to me that they've studied with the Open University or they had their degree in a non-traditional way, I am more admiring of someone that says that to me than someone that tells me they were educated at Oxbridge or Cambridge. And the reason being, I know exactly what they had to go through to achieve that, the kind of grit and determination that would drive them there. So I honestly think that normalising non-standard methods of education, non-standard structures, is going to be so crucial moving forward. The economy is difficult. We know that. And we know that it's probably going to get more difficult. We're in danger of more people missing out on achieving everything that they could achieve and all that talent. Those 8 million people who are still working yet below the glass breadline, those 4 million children, this should be the next generation of doctors, of parliamentarians, of lawyers. Why should they be held back by that invisible glass breadline, that layer of people's perceptions and assumptions that mean they're being limited by what other people think of them and how it affects the way they think about themselves? So before we even start to think about the structural problems, the access to childcare, the being able to afford to pay for education, before we think about any of those, let's think about the things that we can all change today, the things that we can all personally take accountability for and change. And the way that we think about something, the way that we speak about something, the way that we respond to somebody is something that we can all do today. We don't have to wait.
Thank you. That's really powerful, actually. I agree with what you said there about the Open University. I've certainly found, especially since I've come into this role, that some of the most inspirational people I've met have actually undertaken courses through the OU and overcome adversity in order to do that. And I agree with what you say about having different routes. And that's one of the reasons why, under the TARE Act, we've placed a new legal duty through MEDA to invest in those areas of adult education and training that can have the biggest impact. And I think, as part of that is looking at the different venues that we have, because crossing that threshold into a formal educational establishment can be a challenge for lots of people who didn't engage positively with education for whatever reason, usually outside of their control, when they were younger. So, yeah, there's lots we can learn from that, most definitely. And you described education as a lifeline and something that opened up opportunity to you at a time where very few doors were open. So based on that experience then, what changes do you think that we could put in place here in Wales on how we design and deliver adult education to ensure it reaches those who need it most?
Oh, that's a great question. So I talked a little bit about the flexibility to be able to learn. Flexible working is really super important. And there's an element that you can do with legislative change, but there's also a lot that responsible employers can do around that as well. Look, I get it's difficult, particularly if you're a small business owner. I understand some of the challenges that would be associated with introducing flexible working options. But actually, if there were incentives that we could provide that makes it pay to learn, that could be really, really useful. And I'm also a really big fan of opportunities for things like apprenticeships, the way that you can practically learn while you work, the way that you can apply the things that you learn actionably to your workplace can be a really useful way of not just somebody gaining some kind of skill set or formal education from that, but also as an employer. That can be really powerful for improving your workplace, for pushing a little bit further than you thought that you might have, for introducing a new program or a new project with data behind it, with evidence behind it. That can be super powerful. So I think perhaps putting in place ways for workplaces to offer more could be a really powerful way of bridging the gap. But it has to apply to more than just an average workplace. You have to think of ways that you can apply it to people in low-paid jobs as well, because arguably these are the people that are the most trapped by that glass breadline.
Yeah, really interesting. I agree with you there as well. And I think going back to the OU, one of the attractions with the way that they deliver their learning is there's that step on, step off, isn't it? That you can have those modular chunks of learning and then you can come back to it when it suits you, which is just so flexible and so important for those who are working, who've got caring responsibilities or other challenges. And I think certainly something I've seen over the last few months is that more universities, bricks and mortar universities in Wales, are seeing why that is so important and looking to move to that kind of delivery. And I think that's something that that is so important, and it's good to see. I think probably the OU have set the bar high there, and the bricks and mortar unis are looking now to see if they can get a slice of the success, which is only a good thing, isn't it? So that there's more awareness and there's more opportunities open to everyone there. Okay, so let's move on then to the emotional cost of poverty, which you know you turned to that right at the start of your lecture, didn't you? How important is it that we take that into account in our public services and in our education systems? And do you think we're doing enough to understand and respond to the psychological dimensions of inequality?
No, I don't think we are. And I can understand why, because there's so much that we need to do. I can understand why that doesn't necessarily come to the forefront of people's thinking, but it really needs to, because it is an experience for so many that can really hold you back and taint your lens. It really does colour the way that you see the world. One of the things that I introduced in work is something called a shadow board. And the shadow board is made up of people who are underrepresented within the workforce in some way. And what that enabled me to do is really see the consequences of the decisions that we're making before we make them, but from a range of perspectives. And that's been a really powerful way of understanding the ripple effects of the things that we're proposing to do. You know, when you're making a decision, you might be thinking about, if I can use the analogy, throwing a pebble into the pond and making sure it lands in the right bit. You might not catch all of the ripples because you're only looking at it from one angle. By having a shadow board in place, you can see them from multiple angles, and it's really, really powerful. So methods like this can be a really useful way of seeing things from a range of perspectives, and we have to be including socioeconomic status within that. We have to be considering the background that people come from, because it really does inform the experiences that people have had, the way they perceive themselves, the way that they believe they'll be perceived by others, and the way that they are perceived by others. So we have to think about that more. And building a sense of psychological safety into the workplace is crucial. The reason I didn't talk about my experience of homelessness is because I didn't feel psychologically safe. No one intended for me to feel that way, but I'd look at other people who were progressing in their careers, other officers in the service, and they'd all be these amazing people who always knew what to do. They always knew what to say. Mistakes weren't allowed, so you couldn't have any kind of vulnerability. And I'd look at these people and I'd think, I can't possibly match this because I feel vulnerable because this happened. But the problem with that, the problem if you don't have psychological safety, is you're never really going to push yourself any harder because you're going to do the safe bet because you don't want to fail, because failure is punished and success is rewarded. So you'll take those little successes because, you know, no one's going to criticize you. But there's a massive problem with that. And the problem is you're never going to push yourself to do something radical. You're never going to push yourself to progress. How are you going to innovate if people are too scared to take a risk? So considering the emotional part of it is crucial, not just from the perspective of looking at where people come from and how they see the world, but also how you cultivate that environment where people can be really honest about their experiences and their feelings and where they've come from in life. Because that, honestly, is how you're going to innovate. And that makes good business sense as well. That's not just an emotional plea that I'm making. That makes good business sense because that is how you innovate and that is how you progress.
I think you provide a really useful lens through which policymakers can start to look at things in a different way there, because often in government you think of the practical interventions that you can make to alleviate poverty in education. So obviously, you know, universal free school meals, taking that barrier away, a great leveller, raising the amount and the household income threshold for EMA. That was something I was really pleased to be able to do. And just recently as well, I've raised the amount of the Welsh Government Learning Grant for learners over 19, which I think is a really good help to get those adult learners back into the FE sector. and looking as well then to do a full review of that, the way that we did with the MA. So we focus a lot on those practical things, don't we? And I think in government then, we're also very well aware of the importance of mental health and focusing on that, an additional £4 million for MEDA to undertake initiatives across the FE and HE sector to support mental health. But I think you've identified there a missing chunk in the middle, really, and another good lens that we could really look through when we're developing policy. So you talked about the glass bread line, and you certainly broke through that. And I think you've broken through glass ceilings as well in your career since then, obviously with the fire and rescue service. But how important do you think it is that people from disadvantaged backgrounds can actually physically see others like themselves in those leadership roles? And what can we do in public life and in education to try and help make that visibility more common?
I think it's really crucial, because for me, when I was in my really early days and I was coming out of the situations that I'd come out of, I didn't look around and see anyone who reminded me of me. I didn't see anyone that came from the background that I came from, and those that did were really good at hiding it. So I didn't aspire to it because I didn't think it applied to me. So I think it is really important that we have that visibility, but again, part and parcel of that is changing those preconceptions, getting rid of that stigma so people can talk openly. But they're not going to start to do that until people do start to talk openly. So I think it's incumbent on those of us who are in a position to do so to really start to talk about that first and foremost. But I also think, you know what, it can be simple just to think, if I can see it, then I can be it. And that's something that I've long subscribed to. But there is data that shows that sometimes it can put people off because they think that it might be unachievable. So there's something for me about the power of mentoring within this as well. So I think it has to be a dual approach. I think it is really important to give that example, but to recognise that that might not reach everybody. Whereas the power of a mentor, somebody that comes from a similar background or who's in a position in a career that you would want to aspire to, is so powerful. I've mentored many people over the course of my career, and something that I always say is, if I mentor you, I want you to go and mentor somebody else. I need you to pay it forward, whether that's somebody else in the workplace or even somebody in a school that might be thinking about a career, or in the fire service or in the public sector. It is really, really important. So more formal mentoring schemes and informal ones as well. We don't all have to wait for a mentoring scheme that we can join. You know, we all know somebody that we might be able to take out for a coffee on a regular basis and check in and talk to about how they're feeling about their career, opportunities that they could have for further education, possibilities. We can all do that.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really glad that Lee Waters is here to hear that, actually, because Lee, I'll touch on the alumni scheme that you pushed through the Valleys Task Force. You know, both Lee and myself come from, you know, good, solid working class backgrounds in comprehensive schools where we know how difficult it can be for young people to see how they can achieve their potential. Of all the initiatives through the Valleys Task Force, I thought this was one of the really best ones, is trying to get those people who had achieved from those schools back in to mentor those young people. And I think, you know, it's something that we could really do with picking up and working more strongly on. And I think it ties in so nicely to what you said there. Okay, right. One last question from me then. So Raymond Williams believed that education could make hope possible. So what gives you hope at the moment? If you could see one meaningful change in how we address poverty and access to education in Wales, what would that be?
One thing that gives me hope at the moment is seeing people talking about their experiences of poverty. I'm getting a lot of hope from people who are genuinely looking to change the narrative. And I touched in my talk about the work that I was doing with Prince William. around those people experiencing homelessness. And a key part of that programme is exactly that, changing the narrative, getting rid of the stigma, helping to make that recovery from homelessness and that recovery from poverty easier. Now, if we can do that, if we can change the way that people feel about themselves and their own experience, then we give them the ability to progress with one less barrier. It's not going to fix all of it. There are plenty of other barriers. I'm not going to be naive and pretend that's it, that's all we have to do. But believe me, it is a hell of a layer of glazing on that glass bread line. And if we can crack that, we're halfway there.
Well, Sabrina, thank you so much. Raymond Williams believed that education creates hope. Your story shows that exactly, and it gives lots of food for thought for those of us in the policy-making sphere. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you.
Wel, pnawn da pawb. Mae'n bleser I gloi y darlith goffa flynyddol Raymond Williams y pnawn ma. It's my pleasure to bring the event to a close. And I think to do so in person again, after a few years apart, we haven't had an in-person lecture for a little while, makes it all the more meaningful. As Director for Wales at Learning and Work Institute, I'm proud we continue to do the annual lecture. It's a tradition that not only honours the legacy of Raymond Williams, but also keeps alive the radical spirit of learning, equality and democracy that ran through everything he stood for. He once wrote, and you've heard this quote a few times, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. So I read a draft of this speech to my wife last night, and she said, you always use that quote, it's one you use all the time. And I think it is really a good quote because it is really relevant. It speaks to the time we're in. We're in a time of despair quite often, but there is another way. There is a hopeful way, and I think that's what that quote draws out. And I think that belief in the power of education to challenge injustice, transform lives and open up opportunity is something that has run through everything we've discussed so far today. So it's been a great privilege to hear a remarkable lecture from Sabrina. I think she's offered something really powerful, a deeply personal story of resilience and a searing challenge to the social and structural inequalities that so many people, particularly women, as we've heard, still face in the pursuit of opportunity. Her message about smashing the glass bread line, I think, adds a bold new perspective to an esteemed list of Raymond Williams lectures. It's a list that includes lots of big names. So Sir Michael Marmot, we've had Cabinet Secretary for Education in the past, Kirsty Williams, Minister for Lifelong Learning, Jane Davidson in times gone by. The current President of the Republic of Ireland once gave the lecture, although he wasn't the President at the time, Michael D. Higgins. And of course, everybody's fan favourite, Michael Sheen, gave the lecture some time ago. And I think all of them, in their own way, have spoken about the urgent need for justice, dignity and inclusion through education. Sabrina's reminded us not just of the barriers that persist, but the urgency, the possibility and the power of change. I think her story is a testament to what can happen when people are given a second chance and when learning becomes not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. It was also a pleasure then to have a powerful lecture followed by a really interesting Q&A with the Minister taking the lead. So thank you, Vicky, for that. I think that underlines the importance of lifelong learning in public policy in Wales. I think the questions the Minister asked reflect a politician who's got desire to hear our lived experiences and to turn them into progressive change. And I'm glad to hear that come out through the discussion today. And we hope that's something that then gets reflected in public policy in the future. So, from me, as we reflect on today's lecture, perhaps I've got 3 questions that we can take away. The first is, what more can we do to ensure that no one is written off, no matter what their background? How can we embed learning not just in policy, we've spoken a lot about policy today, but in a culture that genuinely values growth at every life stage? How do we honour Raymond Williams, not only by remembering his words, but by acting on them with courage, creativity and care? Those are the 3 key things I think we can take away from this lecture and do our own bit to think about as we contribute to this discussion. Before closing, I'd like to thank the Open University in Wales, whose support makes this lecture possible, It's been a partnership that's gone back a long time and it's really successful. I think their commitment to lifelong learning mirrors everything we celebrate here. They put into deeds every day, things that we put into words in these lectures. And again, thank you all for being here. Your attention, your energy, your ongoing work to make education in Wales more open, more inclusive and more transformative is really important. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi gyd and have a safe onward journey. Thank you.